Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special episode of the Nostalgia Trap podcast. My name is David Parsons. I'm very happy that you have found the show and that you hopefully are enjoying these conversations and that you enjoy listening to me talk to people who are way smarter than I am. Today's guest is no exception. I thought that for the 30th episode, today is episode 30, a little bit of a milestone. I thought I'd bring on someone who is very special to me for a variety of reasons, but probably the biggest reason is that she's my wife. Claudia Moreno Parsons is a professor of English at LaGuardia Community College, and that will probably connect the dots for some of you who wonder, why does David talk to so many LaGuardia Community College professors? Well, my wife introduced me to a whole lot of these great people, and she shares her story now. She sits down and does the whole Nostalgia Trap biography thing. She tells me about growing up in South Brooklyn, an area of Brooklyn that's very different from the Brooklyn that is lodging itself in the public imagination now of hipsters and artisanal macaroni and cheese and things like that. Claudia comes from a different kind of Brooklyn, and she tells me what that means and how it contributed to her development as a thinker and a reader and a political person. I actually learned a lot of stuff about Claudia that I didn't know. I thought that I would be I would know everything that she was going to tell me here, but there were things that I didn't know, and I had a great time talking to her. I hope you enjoy listening to me talk to her. We talk about her book, Amiri Baraka and Ed Dorn, The Collected Letters, which I have to mention. I know this will embarrass her, but I'm very proud that book just won an award, the Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Award for Literature. It's a big deal to me and a big deal to her too, and I wanted to mention that because that book is great stuff. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. There is more Nostalgia Trap on nostalgiatrap.libsyn.com. You can find more on iTunes. If you do download the show on iTunes, it'd be great if you left a comment or a review. That would help me out. If not, no big deal. You can go to Stitcher.com and find the show there. And if you like the show on Facebook, you'll get updates on new episodes and all sorts of other stuff. Again, thanks so much for listening to the show. I hope you enjoy these episodes as much as I've enjoyed making them. I hope to make many more. This is me talking to Claudia Moreno Parsons. I know you very well, obviously.
I hope so.
But there are two things. One are the people listening to this may not know much about you. But also the more I do these podcasts, the more I realize that people don't necessarily plan their lives out, and they where they are and where they end up and where they are right now. And usually it's like an academic or a professor. They're all like, well, I never planned to be this. Happened, and it's something that happened. And yet when you go back, you start to see, like, I don't know, there are little patterns. So maybe we can start with where you're from, since people don't know you. You're from, I know you're from Brooklyn, but what hospital exactly were you born in? Were you born in Brooklyn or were you born in Manhattan?
I was born in Brooklyn, the only one of my sisters who was in a hospital that I think was called Caledonian. We have to look that up and double check that, but I do know that it doesn't exist anymore.
Oh, so I don't want to skip ahead, but you're the hospital you were born in and the high school you went to.
Oh, God!
One of those, and that's funny to think of because we think of New York as such a a consistently present place. A place that, like, the institutions last a long time. You can pass these, the Salvation Army building on 14th Street has been there for us. It says like we opened in 1820.
Right. Both the hospital I was born in and the high school I went to no longer exist.
All right, so I'm assuming you don't. We'll unpack that as we move along, but as your life moves forward, I'm assuming you don't remember being born necessarily, but as your life moves forward, when are you first kind of, I guess, conscious of being raised in a certain part of Brooklyn?
Like
and maybe where is that certain part of Brooklyn?
Okay, so I was born. I grew up in Mill Basin, specifically old Mill Basin, right? Which is the working class part of Mill Basin, as opposed to the new Mill Basin, which is still called new Mill Basin, even though it's not new anymore. But it's a class thing. The new Mill Basin and Bergen Beach are the wealthier parts of that part of the neighborhood, and that's deep South Brooklyn.
Deep South Brooklyn. This is not, in other words, this is not hipster Brooklyn that we think of today.
No.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that you and I talk about a lot, actually, right? That like people have this, I guess, even international idea of Brooklyn as this hip brand now, but South Brooklyn is a place that hasn't really been touched by that yet.
No.
Although there's a food truck there
I
now.
know. I saw that. It's the Hard Time Sundays or something. No, it's because it's too far out there. There's no train station in the neighborhood. You have to take the bus. You have a couple of options for buses to get to the train stations, and so you can't. It's really not walkable. I mean, it would be an epic walk, and so it hasn't been touched yet by people who
work in the city.
Yeah. Although my mom worked in the city, and my mom hauled her ass an hour and a half every day, 30 minutes on the bus, and then the 2 train out to 14th Street. And then even earlier, all the way up to Columbia to the hospital up there.
Yeah,
to
your
St.
mom
Luke's.
had an epic commute.
So
What did your mom? Can you tell me a little bit about your mom and dad? Where are they from, and how did they wind up in Brooklyn?
The same reason that anybody ends up in Brooklyn, because they can't afford Manhattan. Waka waka.
Hey.
I know. Well, my parents,
and that'll probably equal out a little bit as the years go on, because Williamsburg is like one of the most expensive.
Yeah, right. We're all going to Queens now.
Yeah,
Sorry,
everyone's going to go to Queens. Yeah.
My mom was actually born in Puerto Rico and moved to New York when she was, well, she says it was actually twice, that they came when she was about 2, they stayed for a year or 2, something like that, and then they went back to Puerto Rico and came back again for good when she was about 13. Eventually everybody went back to Puerto Rico except for her and one brother, and my father was born in Manhattan.
And what's your father's background?
Italian Americans that basically grew up. I guess they probably got here around the turn of the century or the 20s, the same kind of part of that wave when a lot of Italians were getting to New York and they were poor, grew up through the Depression and
on the Lower East Side.
On the Lower East Side,
yeah. And your dad was raised on the Lower East Side.
Yeah, the Lower East Side really like kind of. I think it's sort of Chinatown now. Like it's where it's sort of that border between Lower East Side and Chinatown.
Yeah, and he was part of. I mean, your father and certainly his parents were part of that. Like I think of like that Scorsese generation of like the Lower East Side Italian immigrant families that had a lot of interaction with Jewish people on the Lower East Side, and it really shows through in the culture. And I mean, we'll talk about that. But like your parents kind of reflect an amalgamation of
classic
different. Of classic New York tropes embodied in single people.
So they met probably in 1968 or 69.
Your parents?
My parents, yeah. And it was actually a very short courtship. That's a silly word.
I know. We still say it, though.
We still say it. A very short courtship. My dad worked
I guess now we say dating. Right? Yeah.
But my dad wouldn't. My parents wouldn't say what they were doing was dating.
I'm sorry
to
interrupt you.
Yeah. But. No. And so my dad worked for his father in the butcher shop on 18th Street, right off First Ave, and the Beth Israel Hospital is right across the street. And my mom is a nurse. And used to come into the butcher shop to get her sandwiches, and my dad would make her sandwiches, and voila.
Is that really the sandwiches?
It was the sandwiches, and my mom
I don't
jokes.
think I've ever heard that. As much as I've heard every story from your dad. I've never heard that story of how
and my mom, if you ask my mom, she laughs because she says that my dad started making bigger and bigger, more gigantic sandwiches, that she used to have to take all the meat out because they were too big, because he was flirting with her. And then, so they got married December 1970, and they moved to Manhattan. They moved to Brooklyn because Manhattan was too expensive, and they couldn't find anything that would accommodate their pretty meager salaries.
And didn't also accommodate your dad's piano.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. My dad has always had an upright piano, which is not a very big piano, but still a piano. And lots of landlords do not want an instrument that size. And my grandmother, my dad's mom, had already moved out to Brooklyn with her husband a couple of years before. And she said, hey, it's pretty inexpensive out here, and it's a nice, quiet little neighborhood. And we ended up, so they moved there about I don't know, a handful of blocks away from my grandmother. And then after a certain point, we moved even closer to her. So we were literally like 2 blocks from her.
So did your dad play the piano a lot when you were a kid? You remember that like it being like a first memory? I can imagine the sound of a piano being memorable.
Yes. And I remember it in the context of having to be quiet a lot. I sort of thought it was cool, but also if Dad was at the piano practicing or writing, which is what he's a composer. We had to be quiet.
What kind of composer would you say your dad is? Because he does music that it doesn't sound like anything else to me, and yet it's within a tradition.
I guess the larger classical tradition, but more avant-garde. Like really like modernist stuff, but not quite like Cage or Steve Reich or Glass, but in there, I guess. I mean, he was really, I think his thesis was on Debussy and sort of like the beginning of the modernism in music Satie, those people. And so he's really influenced by those French composers. And I think he probably falls into that tradition. Although I don't know classical music well enough to say exactly where his stuff would be now. Okay, so you're raised in Brooklyn. You're being raised in Brooklyn by Puerto Rican mom, who is a nurse, and an Italian father who is a composer. Very interesting pieces on piano, but not just that, but like he does whole symphonies. Like he composes for orchestra. So as you're getting older, what kind of kid do you emerge to be? I always ask, like, what if you fell into the archetype of, like, were you the nerd or the jock or the goth kid or whatever? I would imagine, I know how you ended up in terms of being kind of drawn to the academic, but did you like school when you were a kid, or did you hate it? Well, or somewhere in between? Okay. I was this sort of, you could have said the shy, awkward, weird girl, right? I guess sort of nerdy, but not like comic book nerdy, more just that I like to read books. And so school was complicated for me because I was so shy, and I remember spending most of kindergarten crying. And I had met my best friend, Lisa, because we cried together every day for weeks and just sort of hugged each other. It's like going to prison. It really is. Yeah, school at that age felt like it. And part of me really loved, the thing that I really loved about school, and this is interesting because this is what I became, was my teachers. I liked school because they were teachers who were not my parents, who gave me books to read, and that was what I did. And it's such a shameful incident. If Mrs. Phillips is listening to this, my 3rd grade teacher in the 3rd grade, a friend of mine, one of the few friends I had, we worked in the office. We were they called it monitors, right? And it was like the good kids got to get out of the class for a while, and I guess we worked in the office, and we stole a ton of blank report cards, folders, to play school. To play school. To play school. Props. Yes, props to play school. Of chalk, we got in big trouble for it. Yes, we got in big trouble for it, and it was a very shameful moment. But now that I think about it, because you say you don't necessarily end up where you think you're going to end up, but that the signs are there. That was the thing I stole, was teaching supplies. That's funny. Now I know why you brought that up. It's funny because you say you have you were attracted to the teachers, and that was certainly true in my life. But at the same time, I had a lot of teachers, and I won't mention their names either, although it's been a long time. And they were old back then, so I don't know. But I had teachers back then that I was terrified by. That they were like, I had a few like old lady teachers that were really mean and really like defined my experience in a sense, because I had felt like I had nobody there to really take care of me. I think I was super, super lucky in elementary school, PS 203, right? Deep there in Brooklyn. And that was defining for me, because I didn't run into those teachers that you're talking about until high school, when I was still kind of on the outskirts of things, but better equipped, I guess, to deal with that. I didn't need my teachers in the way that I really kind of needed them as a little girl.
Yeah, high school I feel like is the teachers are more like you see through them, and because you're old enough.
Yeah, because you're old enough, exactly.
And you see like, oh, this guy's just a loser. You know what I mean? And it's
right,
like,
and
it's really like shattering of your illusion of authority. You know what I mean?
Well, if you've already gone through it with your parents, then it's not so.
Your parents prime you for being shattered in real life
by your teachers. Yeah, I had lots of amazing teachers in high school, and lots of really, unmemorable ones or unforgettable for bad reasons. You know what I realized that the teachers I don't remember is junior high school. But I think that's a product of being 12, 13, and 14 years old, which is just
a monster.
Who knows who they were.
You really become very into yourself at that moment.
Yes.
And I don't mean that necessarily in a bad narcissistic way.
No, I don't think you can help it.
It just becomes... I don't know. It seems like
form of madness.
Middle school is like such a tunnel in my memories.
Right. I don't remember my teachers.
Like I remember it being. My impressions of middle school are like that it was like an alternate reality. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So many stories. We'll do another episode on just middle school memories.
Oh God, please.
We could do another show, middle school memories. Yeah. So what kind of books were you reading? Because it sounds like books. I know that, and it's one of the first things I knew about you is that books play a really important role in your life in a lot of different ways. But what were you reading when you were in elementary school and into that middle school tunnel?
That's a good question. I guess probably a lot of the same things that other little girls or possibly boys too around my age. There were things like. I would have read a bunch of Judy Blume, things like Blubber. Yeah. I wouldn't have read Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret. That would have probably come a little bit later. That's sort of like a junior high school one.
Is that about menstruation?
Partly. Yeah. Partly. It's what everybody remembers it for.
Yeah, I've always encountered that cultural reference for some reason. It always comes up.
Yeah, I think it's always in print. It keeps coming back around. I would have read a lot of Judy Blume. I would have read a lot of Beverly Cleary, the Ramona and Beezus books. Those were some of the first like longer books, not picture books that I remember reading.
Any darker or scarier stuff?
Oh, I loved scary stuff from the time I was a little kid. And then by the time I got to junior high school, by the time I was 12, I was sneaking Stephen King.
And it's funny you say. Why do you say sneaking Stephen King? Because I felt the same way. Yeah,
because Stephen King is, especially for a young kid, it's illicit because
it's like porno.
It's almost. There's literally usually his older ones have sex scenes in them, but they're also really scary. Some of them, they're really gory. They're really kind of
deal with adult
twisted
stuff.
Yeah, and so I remember, and I think I've told you this before. Other people who know me know this story. The first one that I read about 12 or 13 was Pet Sematary, which remains in my memory one of the scariest books I've ever read.
Yeah,
and my dad had a whole bunch of Kings on the shelves, and I remember reading it and knowing that I wasn't supposed to read it and throwing it under the couch to hide the fact that I was reading it because he wasn't looking for it on the shelf.
It reminds me of me and my brothers hiding our one tape of John Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet. And we thought it was like death metal or something. I don't know why we thought that was so intense. But I bet if I brought it up right now on Spotify and we listened to it, it would sound laugh. Really lame.
Yes, I think lame is the right word.
But like long-haired guys were like the scary people.
Yeah, because when you and I were kids, anything like that was considered scary, and that quote unquote metal shows were the horror. And I remember
Ozzy Osbourne,
right? But not even. I guess Osbourne's not even that scary. But when we
back
were kids,
then, all I knew about it was they like bit the head off a rat or a bat.
I think it was a bat. Yeah. That was I remember at some point
satanic.
As a little kid saying, "I will never go to a rock show ever because that's where people get murdered."
It's funny.
I don't know why I thought that.
Yeah, you have like a conservative streak when you're really really young.
Yeah, because your parents scare you into it. That's why.
Yeah.
Or the media or whatever it is that you sort of, as a little kid, pick up. You hone in on the fear because that's obvious to a kid.
Yeah. So what was your relationship to New York City as you got older?
Right. You had asked me that before about when I knew about being in Brooklyn.
Yeah, and also the way that you imagine Manhattan and the kind of this weird, like, I don't know if it's a sibling relationship or what explains it, but this weird kind of relationship between Manhattan and Brooklyn in each other's imagination. How did that develop in your life as you got older?
Well, I think because my parents are who they are, so they were both from Manhattan. They moved to Brooklyn, not by choice really, but because they sort of felt forced into it, but also partly I have to say because they got married so quickly and their marriage was coming upon them and they just didn't have as much time to look for an apartment as they could have, and so Brooklyn was just easier. But I feel like
if they lived in Manhattan, if they got their choice, they
would have stayed in Manhattan.
But where in Manhattan specifically? You know what I mean?
Probably downtown someplace.
Right.
Downtown or the Upper West Side. But I think even then the Upper West Side was like, it was not a possibility. You know what I mean? Although I don't know. I mean, I don't think so, because when I was a little girl, the parts of the Upper West Side, like where my dad went for his piano to study with his piano teacher, that was already pretty nice over by the park.
He just told me the other day that he went up there about looking at an apartment.
Brand.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. And so they would have stayed in Manhattan, and I think that my dad especially was always a little bit bitter and resentful that he couldn't live in Manhattan. So
join the club.
So consequently, it was one of the few things that I sort of thought I was snobby about. I was a snob. I thought I was better and cooler than everyone else because my family went to quote unquote the city.
Yeah. I remember seeing a little thing that I don't know from a piece of art that was produced by little second graders or third graders or something that you showed me once from your class.
Oh yeah,
and someone else on the card had signed that Claudia who goes to the city.
Yes, it was described.
And it was like this funny thing to me that like other kids were aware that you go to the city.
I was described as quote unquote village. By several different students because I used to hang out in the city, and when I was a little girl, we never hung out in Brooklyn at all. If we went out for dinner, we went to Manhattan.
And where'd you go? What'd you do? When you say hanging out in the village,
with my parents as a little girl, we would have gone for dinners, probably downtown. We definitely went to Central Park a lot. We definitely went to the Museum of Natural History a lot.
Yeah.
Because my dad was still studying with one of his teachers then, that woman, Mrs. Brand.
Yeah.
And she lived up Central Park, near the Dakota. And not in the Dakota, but something around there.
Right.
And so frequently when my dad was up there and it would be like a daytime thing, he'd go study, my mom and I would come up on the train later, meet him there and walk around and have lunch at a diner and walk around the park or walk around the museum. And so that's a really frequent common memory. And then the other one is going out to dinner at like Italian restaurants downtown. I
wonder if any of them are still there.
I don't think so. I feel like there was one that I used to love that used to go down the steps to, and I think it was called Bambino's, which is sort of appropriate, I guess.
Yeah.
But if
your dad were here,
you'd have to ask
my
dad. Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so growing up, I was one of the things that sort of divided me from other kids because we went to Manhattan and most of the other kids around me did not, unless it was like a class trip or I guess maybe if they went for a Broadway show or something like that. And then once I got to high school, that was where I went. And it was a weird thing because a lot of kids were not allowed to take the subway because we were so far out there. The subway's not a regular thing out in Mill Basin.
It's also a different time for the subway in our memory.
And so I'm in high
school.
I would have when I would have been taking it by myself, that would have been the very, very early 90s, 90, 91, 92. So and when I was a kid taking it with my parents, that would have been the 80s.
Yeah, and so that's like the graffiti subway that we think about.
Yes, and I look at pictures now and I'm like, sure, I remember that. And I remember the lights going out, and I remember all the graffiti, and I remember the old red birds on the 2 line.
At what point were you going to the city by yourself? Because I hear stories a lot about like it's parents sending their kids at like 12 to get on the subway and go into New York.
I was about 16. 15, 16. Mm-hmm.
You were quote unquote allowed, I guess.
Well, the first couple of times I went, I was not allowed. I just went.
Yeah.
I told my parents I was going someplace else, and the first few times I went by myself, and it's a funny memory because the very first time I went alone, I went totally by myself. I told my mom I was somewhere, and I wore it must have been Oh, what? Okay, hold on. I have to think years here because I was wearing a very specific early 90s indie girl outfit in which I wore a flowered baby doll dress.
Right.
And my Doc Martens.
Of course.
And that's what I remember wearing, and a little denim jacket over it. And it's important in my memory because I went by myself. I was like, I'm going to go. And then I sort of got nervous going. And I basically just got to the city, walked around a block, and then came back because partly because I thought I was going to get in trouble, and partly because I was nervous that I shouldn't be there, and what was I doing? And I was totally by myself, and I ran home. Yeah, and I ran home, and I must have been about 15, going on 16, so like 90, almost 91. Give or take.
So, that outfit that I imagine you wearing with the Doc Martens and everything.
God, I love that dress.
It implies a certain kind of identification with a certain kind of, cultural thing that was happening in the early 90s, which is, I don't know, Riot Girl or something like that.
Yeah.
Even earlier than that, maybe. I don't know, but like,
it wasn't Riot Girl yet, but it was
how conscious of like, the politics of what you were wearing were you? Or were you just,
very. I think very. I mean, it wasn't, I don't think it was sophisticated.
Yeah.
But it was definitely I was definitely aware that my mother didn't like the dresses and boots.
Yeah.
I was aware that almost no other girl in my school looked like me.
Yeah.
I was very not self-conscious. I was very consciously kind of stepping outside. I thought all the people around me were boring and dumb, or not all of them, but
like,
it's really classic now. When I think about it, I sort of roll my eyes at the level of snobbery.
The disaffected, moody teenager, like Daria.
Yeah. Oh my God! Don't you? Yes.
Oh, it's funny because all that. I mean, it's funny that you can commodify an archetype of teenage behavior like that, because I think of like Emily the Strange at a Hot Topic too, which is literally like an icon, like a cartoon icon of that exact kind of sentiment, of like I don't know, kind of a fuck the world type of attitude.
And it was born out of
MTV.
No, not for me. No, not for me. We didn't have cable. We didn't have cable. It wasn't born out of MTV for me. It was probably more born out of Sassy magazine.
And Rolling Stone was around too.
Yeah, but I wasn't reading. No, I wasn't reading Rolling Stone that young. I mean, I think that my dad used to pick them up every once in a while if it had someone that he was interested in.
Remind me what Sassy magazine was.
So Sassy magazine. Oh, this isn't. It's iconic at this point.
Yeah.
And I cry when I think about. I remember the day of getting rid of all of them in a mood where I was like, I don't need this. What am I holding on to these magazines? And I recycled them all.
Like, it tells you how important it was in your life.
Oh, yeah. No. And so Sassy magazine was a not alternative. I guess it was an alternative to magazines like 17 or the girl magazines that taught you how to put lipstick on and
or even
dating.
Like a Cosmo,
right?
Yeah.
But the teenage version of Cosmo though, like now, like they have Teen Vogue, and so it was things like that, and it wasn't Teen Vogue then. Sassy was about fashion to some extent, but it was also about being weird. It was about politics. It was one of the only teen magazines geared toward girls that talked about it. Probably now that I think about it, probably in a very light way, but still brought up things that were like not just about dating and fashion, that it attempted to have more substance.
Like about what? Like
music and
birth
literature
control and stuff like that? Do they talk about things like that?
I probably I would guess. I don't remember offhand, but I would say
when I think of those like that model of feminism in like the early 90s, it was a lot of talk about like abortion, rape.
Yeah,
and, like,
Sassy would have almost definitely
back against the right wing.
Sassy would have and it definitely said itself as that, and so I would say almost definitely yes. It talked about abortion or talked about the pill.
Is this the woman that went on to found like Jane?
Yeah, I forget her last name. Jane Pratt.
Hey, now it bubbled to the surface.
And then she started some other magazine. I think there was like XO, and then she had Jane first. None of it was as good as Sassy, unfortunately.
So it sounds like this magazine was kind of formative for you, though.
It was because it was the thing that sort of like that I looked to help solidify what I kind of felt, and also made me so. The kind of weirdness that I felt is born out of, being a really shy kid, having parents who were sort of snobbish about where I was from, talking about things that other people's parents I felt weren't talking about, the fact that I like to read books, the fact that I liked art, which is, you know, obviously other kids must have too.
Right.
Right. But at the time I was really on the outside.
Yeah.
And so, and I also made a deliberate sort of like, it was classic. People are like, oh, you're weird. So my response was like, yeah, I'll be weird. I'll show you. You want to see weird? I'll show you weird.
Yeah,
right. And so sassy was like a way to find other people who were sort of doing that too, and to feel a little better about it, I guess, and then kind of get inspiration from.
Yeah.
And I remember getting a lot of inspiration and feeling like really, really looking forward and waiting for that magazine to come every month, that it was a big deal.
I think my equivalent of Sassy Magazine was Mad Magazine.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
The weirdo outsider.
Stage of development at that point.
No, but Mad Magazine is like the weirdo
it's
outsider.
Kind of sophisticated and political. Yeah. No, I still love Mad Magazine.
Yeah.
And ordering whoopee cushions from the back catalog. So, you know, as you head towards, you know, going to college, and you went to you know, for undergrad you went to Brooklyn College, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how did you pick a major? How did you go about like figuring out? Did you have any conception of like what you wanted to do or who you wanted to be at that moment?
Oh man, when I think about college now, my poor students, I think about what they're going through because I remember it so clearly. Me too. And a lot of it is not pleasant.
Yeah.
Those first couple of years, I must have tried to major in every single thing I could have. I went into college thinking that I was going to become a neurosurgeon. I was lofty.
Like literally.
Literally. You know, I was the highest.
Neurosurgeon.
Not just like doctor or surgeon. I was like, no, I'm going to be a neurosurgeon.
I used to tell people I wanted to be like a pediatrician for some reason. Yeah. And I had no idea why. It just seemed like, well, it seems like that's
it's
what
fancy,
I would do.
it's smart.
Make a lot of money, I guess. I don't know.
And so I did the classic, you know, I started out in my freshman year, which was a very, very difficult year. I had a lot of like anxiety and panic attacks in the year between high school and starting college. And starting college, I was still.
I think that's very common, actually.
I was still a little fucked up, you know, when college started, and so I was on academic probation at the end of that semester because I was just not making it to classes, and it was a classic sort of I couldn't get through chem. Because I hated math.
Yeah.
I had stopped taking math in the 10th grade, you know, because I always it wasn't my thing. And I think
Did you have to take that because you were like on the neurosurgeon track?
Yes, I was on the med school track.
Oh,
yes,
really? So
I thought I was.
You like literally started pre-med?
I literally started as pre-med.
Wow.
I was like, I'm going to be.
I guess I started pre-law.
Yeah.
Which sounds ridiculous.
I did that too at some point. Yeah, I did that too. And then I barely survived that, and then was like, I think part of me was resisting the fact that what I like to do the most is read books.
Yeah.
And because I come from a family of teachers, I swear almost 90% of my family on my mom's side, they're all teachers. Even my dad teaches.
Yeah,
and I was like, no, I'm not going to teach. I'm not going to teach. I'm not going to do it. And so I kind of stayed away from what was most natural for me. And I tried all these different things. I thought I'd be an art major. I thought I'd be a religion major. I did, and I ended up in anthropology because it seemed the biggest and broadest that I could do the most in it. And I settled in that. And then within anthropology, I thought I was going to do archaeology. I thought I would do primate behavior. I wanted to be Diane Fossey and go live with the gorillas.
Not Jane Goodall? Why Diane Fossey?
Because I preferred the gorillas. I didn't want to get murdered, obviously, but I wanted to work with gorillas. So that's why Fossey was the sort of model. But that's complicated. Diane Fossey was a complicated figure.
Yeah, that's a whole show in itself.
Right,
talking about primate behavior.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of like the politics of what she was doing went over my head in college. I was just like, oh, gorillas.
Yeah.
I want to do that. I thought I would do...
I meant to ask you, by the way, about Jane Goodall. I don't know. Did you know? Are you aware of like that whole like war that happened between the chimps and how it like blew her mind? There was like a 4-year war between two.
No.
I just read about it the other day. That there was like a.
When was this? Like years ago?
Yeah. It was like in the 1970s. There was she witnessed a 4-year violent war between two packs of chimps that involved revenges. It involved rapes. It involved murders of really brutal varieties, and it changed her mind, completely rearranged her like vision
of thinking of them as peaceful.
Yeah. It complicated her idea that like her hippie idea of like that people have about human beings too, which is that like we're innately peaceful, despite all the evidence showing that we're not.
Yeah, and they're so close to us that it makes sense that we would behave just like they do.
It's disturbing as fuck. There's a whole Wikipedia page
on
that's
the
huge,
war.
On the whole war, and it's detailed. And I mean, what broke her heart was, and she wrote. I was reading her writing about it, and like what broke her heart is to see like chimps that she knew for years and years as like really peaceful chimps
turn into
stomping each other to death, and like ones that had been tender to each other in the past. Oh, it's heartbreaking to read. It's really
depressing.
Crazy.
Yeah. I saw her in college at the Museum of Natural History.
Did you really?
I did, and that was one of the highlights of being in college. It was a little bit later in college, and she came to New York to speak, and a few of us went, and it was. It's funny how when I think about these memories, certain memories, I can remember what I was wearing, and I was wearing a red button-down sort of flowered dress sort of thing. That I really liked that dress, and I used to wear it all the time. Again with my boots.
It's funny how those memories exist.
Yeah,
like that.
the whole thing stands out.
It's imprinted as like what you wore.
Because because it was such an important night. I felt so grown up going to see this talk at the museum. And it was an evening event, and I don't think the museum was open, and like the rest of the museum wasn't open, but it was open for this event. And so I went from, and then within archaeology, anthropology, I thought about art conservatism. I really wanted to be a painter. That was the sort of like secret wish. I still sort of wish I was, but that's not where my skills.
Save that for your 70s. You know what I mean?
Where I rediscover, my third
Weren't we
career.
reading about an old lady that like had like 90 careers like that? Maybe it was the woman that was was in Titanic. I think it was her.
That was but no, we were talking about somebody real.
No,
the actress?
The literal actress from Titanic. Yeah, no, not Kate Winslet's character. No, the literal old lady that the actress. She had a life that was amazing.
Yeah,
that, every 10 years, like in her late 80s, she took up the trumpet, and by her mid 90s, she was like in all these like jazz ensembles and stuff.
Like, okay,
it was amazing,
yes.
Incredibly inspiring, actually.
So I took a ton of studio art classes at which I was. Okay. I thought they were fun, but I was never very good. I took some creative writing classes, which I didn't like. And then graduated with my anthropology degree, took a year off, worked in a bookstore, and said, oh my God, I got to go back to school because this sucks.
Yes.
And then I finally just was like, well, the thing that makes the most sense is books. And so I went back, and that's when I started the English major.
So at a certain point, you kind of dropped the idea of becoming an archegologist or working in anthropology. Was that difficult to say goodbye to? Do you miss that?
Yes and no. I mean, I guess not really. Yeah. It's a really small, tight, enclosed world, and the reality of it is a lot different, I guess, than the sort of romantic vision of it, which is, I guess, true of most things. It just seemed like a world that sort of eats itself a little bit, because
everyone knows anthropology is the most racist discipline of all.
Well, it comes from a racist background. I think it tries not to be now. I think that the thing that really stopped me was this. Even getting into grad school, it was like there are only a handful of programs, and each of them only accept like 2 or 3 people, and I just felt like I'm barking up the wrong tree here. Yeah. This isn't worth it. I'm not going anywhere with this.
So you move on to which it sounds like the same thing I did with history in my choice with graduate school, was to kind of strip down to the very bare essentials. What do you really like to study? And for me, it was always. The history of particularly the 20th century, or particularly just U.S. history, became my obsession after undergraduate years, and that's what guided me to, taking an honest assessment of like, this is what I should get into. It sounds like you did the same thing with English. So you went and got a master's degree first, right?
Yes. I got a master's degree before I went on for my PhD, partly because I literally did not know that programs you could do both.
Yeah, because I did it all at once.
Right,
yeah.
because I think that's a newer thing. My dad had gone and, you get a bachelor's and then a master's. And then if you want to get the PhD.
Right.
But I think that actually worked out far better for me in the long run because especially because I was not an English major as an undergrad, I was not prepared to be a doctoral student in English yet. I needed the master's program was much smaller. It was much more focused, and there were more rules about it. Like you had to take.
You needed the scaffold.
Right, exactly. Like you had to take one course from each area, and then you focused. And I was like, it was useful to me, and I'm glad that I did it like that. I would never have survived the PhD program if I hadn't done that first because I was not ready for it. There's no way I was ready for it.
So, when you finally got to the CUNY Graduate Center, which is where I met you, but actually several years after you'd been there.
Oh, we were both on the tail end of it.
We were both kind of wrapping up our experience there, and moving on to the next phase of our lives. But that CUNY Graduate Center experience remains, I think, pretty central to our lives still in some respects. And what was your experience when you first got to the CUNY Graduate Center? Because I know that you had a focus on weren't you a medievalist?
Yeah.
You were looking at
when I did my master's,
Knights of the Round Table.
No, I was not an Arthurian. No. Thank you. No.
I'm just demonstrating my ignorance. I like to do that every now and again.
No. I was when I made my focus in doing my master's at Brooklyn College, I focused in medieval literature, and my thesis was on the Arabic language influence in Western European medieval lit. So I was looking at people like Chaucer and Dante and how the Arab world and their stories had infiltrated is not the right word. Had sort of inhabit how the Arab world so deeply inhabited the Western European medieval world that you cannot look at the Western European stuff without acknowledging the Arabic influence, which was a radical thing, I guess. And I didn't know that when I started. It seemed sort of obvious to me, but my advisor, Jacqueline de Weaver, she was amazing. She was one of the toughest professors I've ever had. It was the sort of thing that not everyone agreed with, not everyone believed, people didn't want to hear.
Well, yeah, I mean, it sounds like Edward Said's Orientalism a little bit, where it's like we kind of, the West needs that Arabic, kind of world, and at least a kind of image of that world, a certain image of that world, in order to define itself.
Right,
which is an important idea, I think.
And the thing is that very literally, classic Greek and Roman texts, after they'd been burned in various wars, were literally recovered through Arab translations where scholars had come before, made translations, and then taken them, and then they come back to Europe through those translations. It's a long, beautiful, complicated history. And so when I started the grad center, I wanted to continue that work, and I came in as a medievalist. And I remember talking when I first started, there was some hesitation on my acceptance into the program because a lot of people felt like maybe she should be in an actual medieval program because a lot of grad schools have that.
Right.
But it didn't work out. I didn't stay in medieval lit. I don't know if that's because that's how it's the way the program is set up in the grad center. I started taking, I apologize to you, a bunch of history classes, and they hated the way English people talked about stuff and thought about stuff. I know you're not like that, but there's a lot of...
it's a conservative discipline.
These are disciplinary things.
There's a resistance to interdisciplinary work.
Yeah, right. And so...
Not everyone, but among
everyone
certain
at all.
professors.
Right.
Sure.
And I ended up, because... And that was the hesitation, is because medieval studies really is an interdisciplinary study. And I moved away from it, and I ended up in, I barely made it through that first semester and was like, well, maybe I'm not going to do this. And now I don't know what I'm going to do. And I found Ammiel Alcalay, who became my advisor.
Who was one of the guests on this program.
Right.
If you can go back in the catalog and you can listen to Ammiel talk. He's an amazing guy.
Yeah. And I found him. I remember looking through the catalog, and I went to him sort of frantic and desperate. And the class was already closed. I'm like, please, can you let me in? And he took pity on me, and that changed everything. It was really one of those moments with
he
the
was
like
he's like, it's like, I feel like it's a Paul Auster moment, nothing was the same after that. Like,
nothing was the same after that.
Ammiel, and I think he functions this way, like for me too, because through knowing you, which is that Ammiel is like a doorway into this whole world.
Yes,
this whole literary,
yes.
particularly like I would say literary and political world.
Yes, which I was sort of knew a little bit about, and I was on the fringes of, and was interested in, had been interested in, and then he opened up that door, and I stepped into it.
So what is that world exactly? I mean, I know it has something to do with the beats, and it has something to do with like the 50s and 60s ruptures, but it's so much bigger than that.
Yeah,
it's a big project.
What's interesting is that Ammiel, right? He comes from Middle East studies.
Yes.
And so his perspective on things, and he comes to it through poetics. And so the door that he opens up onto is really, I mean, if I have to think about what he does, is that he is trying to disrupt everything. Right? So it's not so much about the beats, but it's about which of the beats that we don't know. Who are the other poets that are happening that are changing things?
Flip over the mythologies.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Flipping the mythologies and like breaking things and finding things that are lost.
Yeah.
And so I totally dug it. And I basically just followed him through the rest of my career there.
Everything's somehow like haunted by the specter of war, like I mean, there's
both internationally and US based,
right? A kind of deep, I don't know, horror or skepticism or reservation about the whole American project. And yet a kind of like consciousness of how, I don't know, profound the whole thing is.
The like, look at this fucking
like
poetry that we
Olsen
make.
People.
Yes, exactly. Like, look at this poetry that comes out of this insane history.
Yeah, for those who want to go down this rabbit hole, a good place to start is Charles Olson.
Yeah.
His writing on Melville in particular that I've read, unbelievable stuff.
Yeah,
and the William Carlos Williams tradition. Lots of, I mean, we could go on and on, but Ammiel got you into all that stuff.
Exactly.
Or at least, I don't know, gave you a passageway into that stuff.
But I think that'd be a way, like, shine the light on the path that I was then like, oh, okay. And that changed it. The medieval, being a medievalist is it's just a whole different thing. And I sort of fell away from it. And what's interesting is though, because when I started my master's, I started out as an American studies person, fell into medieval Arabic stuff because I thought it was fascinating, and then came back to American studies, sort of from that perspective, I guess, an international perspective.
Yeah.
And so I guess it made sense that I went back to where I started, because if I think about the earliest books, I don't know, in high school and college, they were, I don't know, traditions of American storytelling that were fascinating to me. The William Carlos Williams is like, what is this? What is the American idiom?
Yes.
Like, what does that look
questions,
like? And those were the questions that I thought were so fascinating
and worth pursuing.
So
as you begin to work with Ammiel throughout being at the CUNY Graduate Center, do you how did you find the particular two writers that you came to focus on?
What David means is Amiri Baraka and Ed Dorn. And those two writers were always on Ammiel's lists in one way or another, either as required reading or as recommended reading. Yeah. And I really came to it through, I had not known who Ed Dorn was before grad school. I knew who Amiri was before.
Amiri's a much more well-known figure.
Yes,
it seems like.
much more well-known figure. And so I kind of knew who he was. He'd come up in various poetry things. And Ed Dorn's work, but that was sort of how I came to it. His poetry, but particularly his book, The Shoshonians, which is what I thought I would write my dissertation on.
Can you explain what that book is, The Shoshonians?
Oh, that's a good question. Can I explain The Shoshonians? Shoshonians is like 1960s. Correct me if I'm wrong. And he travels to Shoshone territory in the mid 60s with Leroy Lucas, who at that time, he sometimes went by Leroy McLucas, but generally it's Leroy Lucas, who was an African American photographer, is an African American photographer. He's still alive.
Yeah.
And they go to, it's like Utah, Nevada for the most part. And they travel around and they talk. Basically, Dorn just talks to people and he writes. It's really interesting because I don't totally know how to describe it because it's not formal anthropology. It's not formally literature. It's not quite journalism. It's sort of all of those things.
Yeah,
Basically,
yeah.
Dorn, they travel. Lucas takes photographs. Dorn talks to people and essentially describes what he sees through a poet's eyes, because that's what he was primarily.
And all that like kind of like formal, I don't know, the formal experimentation of the framework of that book seems like totally unpretentious to me.
Yeah,
it seems
it
like
is,
it was actually
yes.
like the form is actually like demanded by the content of what he's writing.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and that's why. And it was actually just reprinted after having been out of print for years and years and years. Which is, I was so happy to see it back in print. It's a really amazing book that. It unpretentious is the right way to do it. He doesn't.
It's not like he's trying to be like, this postmodern author that's doing this
not
crazy
at all.
thing.
And he doesn't presume.
It's just totally unaffected and beautiful.
He doesn't
way.
presume to know more than he knows. He doesn't presume to know what to say about what he's seeing. He essentially just describes it, but in his, I mean, that oversimplifies it because he describes in the very particular Dorn sort of way.
Yeah. So how did you come across and come to this project of writing about their letters? Because
right.
For those that don't know, Claudia is the editor of an amazing book about Ed Dorn and Mary Braca's letters, and they're kind of amazing correspondence.
Yeah.
And when did you become aware that these letters existed?
Those I couldn't say what year it was. I'm gonna guess probably 2006-ish, give or take. And there was the Chicago Review. There was a special issue in one year. And I ordered. I got it was out of print already, or not out of print, but it was from a few years before I got to it. And I ordered it. I think it was from 2001. And it's a book. It's an issue of the Chicago Review that's entirely dedicated to Dorn. It's all these essays, and there were. It's a really great edition. And there were samples of letters from Ed to and from various different people. And the letters are amazing because his writing it comes through, and the things he was saying. And so in conversation with Ammiel, I was asking him about, what can I do with this, and where do I find more of this? And the Chicago Review has the little listing of like the archives where all the letters are. And Ammiel said, well, you can do that as a dissertation. What?
Yeah.
And so it falls into the rubric of textual scholarship in American studies. And I essentially annotated letters. And I originally wanted to do lots of people, but the recommendation from several people was, including Ammiel, was you probably want to pick one correspondent because Ed wrote so many letters to so many people.
Makes you wonder if there are a million other projects that are there.
Oh, totally. Totally. Yes. I could spend a life just putting together his letters.
Dorn's letters.
Yeah. And this project I was really lucky with it because I was able to get permission from Amiri when he was alive, and from Ed Dorn's widow, Jennifer Dorn, so that I could actually present a book of correspondence that was in order with both poets, because often what you find when you get books of letters is only one side. And so this is actually, you get to read the conversation, and it's not totally complete. There's lots of missing letters, but it is as close to complete as possible. And it's 1959 to 1965. So it's a very, very specific, like, these poets are just getting started, and they are trying to figure out how to be public poets and how to be published and all of that.
And Mary Braca just passed away last year. I don't know. It was just devastating in a lot of ways to lose him. I know he was, I think, 79 years old. But you worked with him a little bit. You met him a few times.
Times, yeah.
What kind of guy was Mary Braca?
That's a big question. I mean, meeting him was one of those sort of rock star moments of like, wow, I can't believe I'm really going to meet this person.
Right.
And I was always a little bit afraid, I guess, because of the esteem I hold him as a poet,
Yeah.
and as a writer, and also just the crazy things that he said, right? And so I didn't know what he would think of me. I was never totally sure what he thought of me. He was always very nice to me.
Yeah. He's an intense guy. And
But a very, to the very, very end, we saw him, right? We got to see him do a reading at the St. Mark's Poetry Project, which I got to introduce him, he was like, I felt like I didn't do a good enough job.
Oh, it was amazing though. I mean, he was like a stand-up comic.
Yeah.
He got up there and did a bunch of like just crushing racial jokes.
Yeah, and political jokes that were, and so it was always, I never got to know him super well. He was always very nice to me. He always remembered who I was. Usually remembered who I was.
And Ed Dorn, for those that don't know, died in
99.
99. Yeah,
right.
So obviously you never got to know him.
Right.
But you do know his wife, Jenny Dorn.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, I always like to talk a little bit about teaching, and you spend, since you work at CUNY and you're a professor at CUNY, you spend most of your time teaching classes on English literature and writing and stuff like that. I know it's kind of a corny question, but like, and I know this isn't a job talk or anything like that or an interview, but like, what are you trying to communicate to your students? Like what do you hope that your students get out of your classes?
Oh God. Next. No.
I want your top 3 answers.
Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
Right now, for example, you're working on a V for Vendetta.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
right.
Which is such and the graphic novel.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And like, what your students sound like they're really excited about
they
it.
Are. They this particular class is really loving this book.
Yeah.
I guess if I, the sort of what I want my students to be is, more open thinkers. I want them to be critical thinkers, which I think at 18, some of us are or were starting to be that.
Yeah.
But kind of needed a little push to help see into things, to help. I want them to look at things in a more complicated way than they do. I want to, sort of ruin films and books for them is the way that some of them put it.
Turn on and strengthen their bullshit detector.
Yes, totally. I want them to be able to see the apparatus. I want to sort of take the veil from their eyes. That's like when you watch the news or you read a book, there's a layer, there's a screen in front of it. You have to get that screen off to see what's really happening.
Just a million little structures that are holding all of this together. Yeah.
Yes.
And you can start to inspect them, and it changes the way you think about your own life.
So so what I really want them to learn to do, I guess, is to think and to be excited about thinking.
And like not value thinking.
And maybe just value it. And that's the sort of like, I guess, the overarching goal of whether I'm teaching writing or I'm teaching sci-fi or teaching fantasy or teaching, I don't know, early American lit, which I've done too, things like that, so that it's looking at like just being able to think about what they have beyond just the, like I always make the joke. I always tell them, I don't care if you're bored. Yeah. It doesn't matter to me.
Right.
I don't even care if you like it. Doesn't matter. What I want to know is, right, not the point. Like why, and pushing them and driving them a little bit crazy to kind of go deeper into their own thoughts because they have it in them and they don't always know how to access it, I guess.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah. And it doesn't work for everyone, but
right. No, but it works for some of them.
Enough, you hope. And
I hope so.
It's funny because I was just thinking about like, the trying to install a better bullshit detector is basically, a way of thinking about teaching critical thinking. But like, it's funny that you become a teacher that does that because, the image of the sullen teenager is the ultimate, like the sullen teenager is always like, this is bullshit.
It's bullshit. Everything's bullshit.
Everything's bullshit.
Everything
you know what
is,
I mean? And it's like, so you already
yeah.
have like a kind of natural kind of inclination to like look at the world and see it as like not real or what.
Yes.
And so, and as you get older, what you hope is that like that Daria figure, that like, sullen teenager that hates everything, starts to kind of complicate the what's bullshit and what's not.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. And
or like, why is it bullshit?
Right.
How is it bullshit?
Exactly. Because as a teenager, 15, 16, 17, I knew things were bullshit, but I didn't totally understand why. Right. Yeah. And so, having gone, 20 years from that point, how do I and having some more sense of it, I want to give my students some of that, get them on their own path of like why is it bullshit? And some of them don't necessarily think it is bullshit. I mean, I think at CUNY, our students do know that there's a lot of bullshit. They're not, they know that shit is fucked, right? Yeah. But they don't totally know.
Not all of them, though.
Not all of them. Not
you
all
almost
of
feel
them.
bad telling them. You know what
sometimes,
I mean?
yeah. Sometimes
it's gotta be. You gotta, like we were saying the other day about stand-up comedy. You gotta kind of package it a little bit. It's not just like everything sucks.
No. And that's a lot of why I teach things like science fiction.
Yeah.
Right. Or graphic novels.
It's not that everything sucks. It's why does everything suck?
and what's good and all that. Yeah, because it's. I mean, the other thing for me is that I'm just a big old, a dork when it comes to books. I cannot read enough books,
right?
And watch enough, storytelling, and I can't watch enough films, and so I share that with them. And some of them really dig it, and some of them they move on.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of putting it. I mean, when I think back, the first time I came to your apartment in Brooklyn, the two things I noticed were books everywhere, like tons and tons of books, and not just books, but like books from all kinds of different books. And also that. If you remember, in your bathroom, you had like like rock and roll icons, kind of like
papered. I had sort of made a fake wallpaper with all these cutouts, like a collage, I guess, of musicians.
And they were particularly like 60s and 70s rock and rollers. I feel like I saw like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones,
Dylan,
the Who and things like that. And as we're sitting here, there's a Dylan poster, right in front of us.
Yeah.
And we have decorated our own house and filled our own house now, many years later, with lots of books, lots of the same books, and all my books, and cats, and and covered our
and
walls
rock and roll,
with posters of Patti Smith and Neil Young and stuff like that. Like I don't know. We could interrogate that. There's something to that.
Because I mean, if I think about the learning to read, right? Not like literally learning to read, but like the finding books at growing up, right?
Yeah.
Is that my dad? I grew up in a house full of books. My dad had tons of books, and after a certain point, I could just take. I didn't have to sneak anymore, and I could take whatever I wanted off the shelf.
Right.
And his reading tradition was really it leaned, I guess, in the same way his musical traditions lean toward the French, toward the European, the Western European, and also particular like early American stuff, not like 19th century early American or 17th century or 18th century, but like the early 20th century modernism, right? Like the Hemingway and Joyce and people like that. It was definitely male dominated. His bookshelves were male dominated, and that's where I started. But when I sort of, as I started reading all his books and then finding books on my own, and it's, it's almost a fucking cliche that's like, I read Ginsberg and I read Kerouac and I got my mind blown. I was 15 years old, 14 years old.
That's when you're supposed to read that stuff.
Right. And I did. And so it makes sense then that the like, our icons, I guess, in a sense, would come from that particular space because it's a shift and a break in American culture.
I know. It feels like, on the one hand, it feels like a cliche that we have like these rock and roll posters all over the wall, but at the same time, it seems very fitting that these icons kind of, very much contributed to my own identity formation. And that's a whole other show too. I feel like we could do a lot more of these. Claudia, thanks so much for talking to me.
Thank you very much.